Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today for our responsive email 101 webinar. Throughout the webinar, you can submit questions via the Q&A panel, and we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. The session is being recorded, and we will send out a recording to everyone that's registered within the next few days. And please follow us on Twitter. Our handle's @LitmusApp, and the hashtag for this webinar is responsive email. And with that, we'll get started, and I'll switch controls over to Kevin.
Thanks, Lauren. All right, guys, we're going to get right into this today. Welcome to Responsive Email 101, HTML and CSS Basics. We're going to be going over just a lot of the basic things for responsive email, really giving you a better understanding of HTML and CSS basics as it relates to responsive email. We're not going to be going over a lot of advanced techniques or topics for this. We just want to make sure you understand what responsive email is and how you can implement it. So I'm your host for today. I am Kevin Mandeville. I am a designer here at Litmus, and I actually design the majority of the emails that we send out here at Litmus. So you can follow me on Twitter at Kevin Mandeville. But for today's webinar, make sure you tweet at Litmus app with any questions or ask questions right within the GoToWebinar. And be sure to use the hashtag responsive email so everybody can follow along the conversation there. So just a quick agenda, quick 5 minutes here for housekeeping items and introduction. We're going to spend the next 20 minutes going over slides and really understanding responsive email. Before we even really dive into actually doing anything with code, we want to make sure you understand what responsive email is, where it's applicable, where it's supported, where it isn't, and what you can do with it. Then we'll jump in and actually go through a coding exercise of building a simple, basic responsive email from scratch. And then we're going to leave about 15 minutes at the end to answer any questions that you may have. So the first thing I want to go over, what is responsive email? And I essentially tweaked what the responsive design definition is for web design. And it's a little bit, hard to put it in the same context for responsive email. But responsive email, it's essentially email that responds to the subscriber's environment based on their screen size and email client and their environment. It's a very big factor, the email client that we get into. So that, in a nutshell, is basically what responsive email is. Here's a great example that shows what you can do with responsive email, and it's an example from Twitter. And you can see here that they've actually moved a whole bunch of things around. You can see the Twitter flag ribbon that they have on the top left for mobile was moved to the right. They stacked columns with their key image and then headline and subparagraph. They even changed the button content and button copy and text for the main call to action button for mobile. So there's a lot of things that you can do to make a design respond to the environment that you're in. And this is a great example of one that's responded for a mobile client. And we're going to go over a whole bunch of more examples of all this as well. With responsive, that's what you can do. You can resize content. You can make images larger, smaller, text larger, smaller. You can actually hide or show different content based on the experience. You can stack columns and move layouts around. So there's a whole bunch of different things you can do with responsive email design. And a big thing that I want to clarify, which we'll get into later, and I'm going to show you actual examples, is that there's a difference between these three key things, which a lot of people get confused. The first is a fluid email, which is essentially a full width of a single viewport or breakpoint. It's basically just 100% width, and if you scale it and move it around, it's just maintaining its 100% width. It's not really, doing anything besides that. Then there are adaptive emails or design, which a lot of people confuse with actual responsive email. What adaptive does is it essentially has fixed widths at multiple viewports or breakpoints. So if you had an email at 1,000 pixels wide for, a standard base, and then you resize the screen down to 600, then it might jump down to 600. But it's always at fixed widths at multiple breakpoints. There's not any fluidity to adaptive, and we're going to go over examples for it. But responsive is actually fluid widths at multiple viewports and breakpoints. So a truly responsive email accounts for fluidity across multiple sizes. And we'll go over each of these examples in action once we get to the coding examples. So why is responsive email important? So if you look here at our graph, it's an actual environment growth of mobile, desktop, and webmail email since 2011. We at Litmus actually we track with our email analytics, and we track over 1 billion emails a month now as to what emails are going out and where people are opening them. And the major trend that you'll see here is that mobile started all the way down at 8% in January of 2011. And if you look up to today, in January, it's all the way up to 47%. And you can see desktop is all the way down on the decline and mobile's on the rise. Webmail has stayed relatively flat, but mobile is on the major increase. And if you just single it out, just look at how big that rise is. It's grown over 500% since 2011. That's a really big stat. If people don't believe in mobile, just look at what's happening. Over 500% in 4 years' time here. It's pretty incredible. And here's a breakdown of what we have for an adjusted environment market share. So Gmail actually introduced image caching last year, which impacted how email analytics track opens and where they're open. And it basically became hard to determine whether email is actually being opened on, say the Gmail app or the, Gmail through the webmail. And so we've actually adjusted these figures to account for the discrepancy between the new reporting. And if you actually take into account the adjusted environment market share, mobile is already at 53%, over half of the entire email client market share. So 53% of emails are opened on mobile now. Pretty big jump. And you can go to emailclientmarketshare.com to view our stats every single month with updated numbers on the email clients. And Lauren is actually tweeting out this link at Litmus app right now as well on Twitter for you to follow along with. So be sure you're following. She's going to be sharing some awesome links as I go through the presentation. Some other great stats that we found, we did a recent study with MailChimp and actually made an infographic, and we analyzed over 300 million emails with them and found what's the impact of responsive design. How does it really impact the engagement of emails with users? And we found that there is a 15% increase in unique clicks for responsive emails compared to non-responsive emails. So right away, you're going to get a 15% boost on average in your unique clicks if your email is just responsive. Additionally, there's a 30% increase in click rate for the first link in responsive emails, which makes a lot of sense. If you're really optimizing for the design and the experience of mobile, right away, more people are going to engage with your email right off the bat. So a 30% increase in the click rate for the first link in responsive emails. And you can look up this infographic on the Litmus blog. You can just search Litmus MailChimp infographic, but Lauren is also tweeting and sharing this link out right now as well. Here's another big thing to go over. This was a great study done by Blue Hornet where they said, if you get a mobile email that doesn't look good, what do you do with your email? And over 80% of the users said they just delete the email. And over 30% said they unsubscribe. And I know this doesn't add up to 100%, but this is because they're doing multiple actions. So a lot of users are not only deleting their email, they're also unsubscribing from your email as well. So there's maybe this whole myth between, people will read it on desktop later, or they'll read it anyways, even if your email isn't optimized for mobile. And that's just not the case. The majority of users are deleting your email and unsubscribing it if it's not optimized for a mobile experience. Users are expecting a great mobile experience now. And that's what, aside from all these numbers as to why responsive email is important, you just want to make sure you create a great experience for your subscribers. If you really value design and you really value your subscribers, you want to be able to create a great experience for them. This is a great example here of our marketing manager, Justine, who had to go through this transaction with Bank of America through their website and an ATM transaction. And this was the email she got from them after the fact, which really just isn't a nice email for something that was mobile first, through the website, through her experience. And to get a non-optimized email from that experience, it's just not ideal. So we want to make sure we're taking care of our users, really caring about our users, and providing a good experience for them on mobile. So here's probably the most important section of the entire webinar, if you ask me. And this is the question, where is responsive email supported? So the thing about email is that it's very fragmented with various email clients and apps. There's just so much fragmentation, and there's very different support with all these different email clients. And the one thing that you may not know is that responsive email is not supported everywhere. It's not. No matter what you do, if you want to be able to get responsive email to work everywhere, you're going to have to use workarounds simply because responsive email isn't supported everywhere. Not every single email client or email app supports it. In fact, only 47% of the email client market share supports responsive email. And that's large in part due to Apple Mail and iOS, and basically the Apple products being able to support responsive email. A lot of the other email clients and apps do not support responsive email. So this is a key consideration that you need to take into account when working with responsive email. And another big thing too, which is a common misconception, is that responsive email support is not by device, it's really by app. So you can't say, oh, responsive email works on an iPhone. It depends. In this example here that I'm showing you, responsive email is supported on the right by the native Mail app in iOS, but it's not supported by the Inbox by Gmail app in iOS. So it's the same exact device, both on the iPhone, but using different apps, and there's different support for it. So that's a very common misconception. Responsive email, it really works on an app by app basis. It goes email client by email client, not by devices. So if there's a lot of confusion amongst your team or understanding around why responsive email may work or not work in different email clients, this is the reason. It's app by app basis. Here's a great example here. The same exact email. On the left-hand side is rendering in the Gmail app on Android, and on the right is rendering an email app on Android for the native Mail app. So the left is Gmail, the right is the native app. The right has great support, the left doesn't have support, and it's not as great of an experience for those users. Here's another example. Again, on the left, the iPhone native email app, which works great. The Android native email app looks good. Android Gmail app, same email, all various different support for media queries and responsive email, and it displays your email differently. So a big thing too, which a lot of people use, is that Gmail does not support responsive email in any of their apps. It doesn't work on their webmail through the actual Gmail interface. It doesn't work on Inbox by Gmail. It doesn't work on the Gmail apps. Gmail does not support responsive email. So you should all tweet at Gmail and say, hey guys, we'd really love responsive email support. Make our lives a lot easier to give love to our subscribers. Here's a great chart which breaks down media query support for mobile email apps. And obviously the big offenders are the Gmail apps. Windows Phone, there is limitations around the different Windows Phone. I'll show you a little hack you can use to get that working in there now. None for Yahoo. So there's just a lot of, not a lot of support for media queries in mobile email apps, which is unfortunate. And this is a great support table from Style Campaign. Lauren is tweeting this out at Litmus app right now for you to get that link. And again, all these resources are going to be shared with you after the fact, whole slides, recording, and everything. So don't worry about not seeing any of this. So now we're going to jump into how to code a responsive email and sort of the nuts and bolts of responsive email. So with responsive email design, we are going to use what's called media queries to detect screen size and alter the content and layout of our email. It's important to note that a lot of people have this common misconception of, oh, where's this one line of code I can put into my email to make it responsive? But it's much more than a single line of code. There's a lot of consideration when it goes into email design. It can be very simple in nature, but there's a lot that goes into it. And essentially what media queries are is a set of conditional statements that enable specific styles to be turned on for those statements. So for example, we can say if the screen size is X, so maybe it's 600 pixels, then display Y. Display this image that we only want to show for mobile. Or if the screen size is X, then increase the headline size, the font size, to be Y. Or if the screen size is X, then change the image size to be 100%. And again, it's important to note, as we just went over, media queries aren't supported everywhere. So I'm going to walk you through some of the basic concepts of responsive email, and then we'll get into the actual coding exercise. So we'll walk through it here first, and then we'll go through the actual coding exercise. So here we have our HTML element of a table with an attribute with a width of 600. And then to make our to be able to target this for responsive email, we need to add a specific class for a mobile styling. So here we're going to add a class of responsive table. And essentially classes, if you aren't familiar with HTML, it basically allows us to target it, to add styling to it, and control how it looks and acts for mobile. Again, if you aren't completely familiar with HTML, this is something that you can really follow along and pick up, but I'm sort of working on the assumption that you're going to be able to follow along with the majority of the basic concepts of HTML. So once we've added a class to whatever HTML element that we want, we can actually go and create our media query, which is going to help us target styling for the responsive environment. So here in our CSS, we can simply add an @media query to start. So it's just as simple as an @media. Then the next thing we're going to do is add or define it as screen. So we're going to do @media screen. And this is basically targeting the environment that we're doing, which is going to be a screen for all of the email clients that we're targeting for responsive email. And then we're going to define a condition for the media query. So we're going to say @media screen, and typically media queries for email deal with max width. So at this case, we'll say max width 600 pixels. So what we're basically saying is that anything 600 pixels or below, because the 600 pixel width is the max, we want to trigger these CSS styles. And so you can see that we'll be able to add and insert any styling that we want for this responsive condition inside. So it's typically max width. There's other things you can do like max device width. You may need to do min width depending on how you approach responsive email, but it's typically you'll use max width for most cases when you're dealing with responsive email. So that's where we define the media query condition. And then once we define the condition, we can insert all styles within those media queries. So you can see we have @media screen and max width 600 pixels. And then we're going to target the table HTML element that we just had with attribute selector. So we're going to call out table and then have the class of responsive table. And this is known as an attribute selector. This is typically done to get a workaround for Yahoo. If you didn't use this, then Yahoo Mail for the webmail would actually trigger your responsive styles, which was a bad thing. Now, for those of you who have been keeping up with this, they actually released a fix so that you would no longer need to use attribute selectors, which is typically not how you would use CSS, but this is how email design has been done for the most recently, and it's good for you to understand and know how it's been done so that when you look at the most recent emails and past emails that have been sent out, you can follow along with this style of coding. And so then it's basically just a simple CSS statement there where we have, the selector, property, and the value. So we can say that width of 100%. And then we typically use the important declaration to overwrite inline styling if we have any. So again, yes, you want to use attribute selectors as a Yahoo workaround, which may not be needed moving forward, but it's good to know that's how it's been done and it's how I want to teach you. Otherwise, we can just revolve back to the simple CSS definitions for web design. And then again, using important to override any inline styles. And one other big consideration is that we're going to want to add specific meta tags to make the email responsive. So the first meta tag we're going to want to use is a very common, simple, out-of-the-box meta tag, which you'll really need to make anything responsive. So this is the one that I use and recommend, the simply using meta name equals viewport, content equals width, device width with initial scale of 1. And then for the bottom meta tag, we're going to use to actually help make this responsive on the Windows Phone. So it's a simple little hack to make your email responsive for Windows Phone and to enable your responsive styles. All right, so now that we've done that, we're going to hop into our little coding exercise. So I'm going to hop out of these slides here and hop into Builder. So the first thing I want to do is show you let me just increase the font size here so you can better see this. So essentially, I'm going to go over just the simple examples that I talked about before as to what the differences between fluid, adaptive, and responsive are. So this is an example of a fluid email where if you have it at its set width and you resize it, it's simply just holding 100%, but you can see it stops being responsive at a certain point. It's simply just maintaining 100% width here. And that's what a fluid email is. It's just maintaining the full width of its container. For an adaptive email, it's a little bit different. And this is a great example of an adaptive email. What you can do is you can resize, and you'll see that once you hit a certain breakpoint, it jumps and it resizes to a fixed width. You can see it's not actually fluid. So if I resize, it's not being fluid, it's just a fixed width. And then if I hit another breakpoint, there it is with another fixed width as well. So it's simply fixed widths at multiple breakpoints, and it's not fluid. And then an example of a responsive email would be something that's completely fluid at multiple breakpoints. So here you can see once I hit a breakpoint, it's completely fluid in rescaling and resizing no matter what size I move it at. So that's what a responsive email is and what we're going to do for a very simple one. So Lauren is actually going to tweet out the final version of what we're working on so that you can follow along if you happen to get lost or just think it's a lot to be copying and pasting or trying to retype or redo what I do. So she's going to be tweeting that out right now at Litmus app for you to follow along with the builder link that we have. So the first thing that we're going to do here is start to build out our structure and our foundation with our HTML. So I'm just going to leave a little comment here to call this full width container just so you can see what we're doing. And we're going to just build out a simple table. So I'm just going to use some Emmet shortcuts here. If you aren't familiar with Emmet, it's simply a shortcut way of writing HTML. You can go to emmet.io for more, but I'm just going to use that to help speed some things up as I show you. So here we have our basic first table structure. And what we're going to do is just add some simple HTML attributes to it. So the first thing we're going to do is add a width of 100% to it. We're going to put cell spacing at 0, cell padding at 0, and a border of 0. And that's going to create our first full width container. So there's nothing going on in our email right now. It's just a full width table. But now this is where we're going to put in the rest of our content. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to nest a table inside of this full width container. And this is going to be essentially like our 600 pixel like container table where all of our content is going to be stored. So let's create a new table inside here. And for this, we're going to add an HTML attribute width of 600. And then we're essentially going to do the same exact thing again with adding cell spacing and padding to 0 and the border to 0 as well to eliminate any gaps essentially in the email. So here we have the basic structure for our email. There's nothing in it yet, but here we have our full width and it's containing our 600 pixel container. I'm also just going to align our 600 pixel container to the center. So the first TD in our first full width container, we're just going to align that to center. So now that we have our 600 pixel container, we're going to start to add content into it. And the first thing that I'm going to do to add content in is actually add an image. So I have an image of a stock photo here that I'm going to add in. It already has its predefined width and height of a 600 by 300 image. And so if we were to resize a preview pane here, you can see that as we resize it, it doesn't respond. So the first thing I want to go over is how to actually make your image responsive. So what we're going to do in the head of our document is we're going to add in our style. So we're going to do style type equals text slash CSS and close that. And then we're going to add in our CSS here so that you can see everything all in one fell swoop. So to start, let's start with our media query. So we're going to do @media screen as we talked about to define it. And then we're going to add our conditions. So we're going to say and we're going to do a max width of 600 pixels. And then we're going to add our braces so that everything now inside of this media query is what will be triggered from 600 pixels and below. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is actually add a class to our image. So let's add a class and we're going to call it responsive-image so that we can target it. And then inside of our media query now, we can actually target the HTML element with the attribute selector. So we're going to do img, then use a bracket and use the class of responsive-image, introduce another opening braces and closing brace. So then we can now put our CSS for this actual image right inside here. So let's put a max width of 100%. And since there's inline HTML attributes, we actually need to use the important declaration to overwrite this. And then let's also use height of auto. So that will automatically adjust the height for us. So now, as we resize the image, well, actually first, we need to resize. I skipped a step with resizing our table. It's pretty important. So before we can resize the image and make sure that's responsive, let's make sure we resize our table, which is fixed at 600 right here. So let's add in a class of responsive-table. And then up in the media query, we can target this. Again, this is a table HTML element. So we're going to target it using table in the attribute selector, and then with a class of responsive-table. Do our opening and closing braces, and we are going to change this to a width of 100%. And again, since it has an inline HTML attribute, we're going to use important to override it. And now, when I resize it, you'll see that the image is now responding exactly as I'd like it to behave. It's being responsive. So that's right away. This is how you can see with just a very simple structure, we're already getting into responsive elements here, which is really nice, simple, and easy. So now that we have an image in there, let's actually add some text. So let's create a new table row with a new table cell. And inside here, let's put in some, actually, let's put in our headline. So let's say I and heart stock photos. And for this table cell, we can actually align it center. So we're going to, align it to the center. And let's add some inline styling to it like we would for a typical email. Let's change the font size so we can see it up to 48 pixels. Let's add a little bit of padding to the top so it has some space from the image. So we'll give it a 20 pixel padding on the top. And then let's actually add a class for this so that we can actually change this responsively. So we're going to add a class of headline to the actual table cell element. So now if I go into our media query, let's actually switch it up and change it for mobile. So since this is a table cell and a TD, we're going to use TD to target the HTML element in our attribute selector using a class of headline. And we can really change whatever we want about this headline. But for this, let's actually make the font size a bit smaller for mobile because we don't need it to be as big for mobile. And again, since it's an inline styling, we'll need to use the important declaration for our font size. Let's actually do something different. Let's change the background color too. So let's change the background to a color of, I'm doing hexadecimal 2 across the board. And let's change the font color to be white. So we'll use the hexadecimal color FFFF. And we'll also add a padding to the bottom of it as well, since we're going to have equal padding. So padding bottom of 20 pixels. Again, since we're adding new styles here, we don't necessarily need to use the important declaration. You only need to use the important declaration when you're overriding existing inline CSS or HTML attributes. But now, if we take this and resize, you can see that once we hit 600 pixels, and you can see the dimensions in the lower right, once we hit 600 pixels, boom, the media queries get activated, and they already start. So there you can see it's starting to respond already for a simple one column design. So let's just add in another table row here with some more, just some more copy. So I'm just going to put in some lorem ipsum to make it nice and easy. And let's actually get into, and you can see that if we resize it, seeing as it's the full width, it's sticking around. So let's actually get into doing a 2-column layout into a 1-column so that we can go over how you can sort of control different layouts and sort of change around the layouts. So for that, what we're going to do is create a new table row in its own table cell. And inside this table cell, we're actually going to create 2 different tables. So let's create another new table nested inside of that table cell. And for this table, we're going to give it a width of 300. We're going to want it to take up 50% of the overall. So since we had a width of 600 here as our sort of parent container, we're going to give it a width of 300. And we're actually going to align the first one to the right. And I'll show you why in a minute. And let's create another table right below that now. And we can give it a width of 300 as well, but we're going to align this one to the left. And there's nothing in these tables yet. So what we can do is add in some dummy copy. So I'm just going to add in some lorem ipsum there. And some lorem ipsum in this one as well. And to make this easier to read, let us add in a background color. So we're going to add background color right at the table cell level. So for the table aligned to the right, we can add a color of, I'm just going to put A in there for hexadecimal all the way. And for the other table, we're going to add in a BG color of, let's just call it hexadecimal D all the way. And to eliminate some gaps, we can add in our cell spacing of 0, cell padding of 0 to those tables as well, border of 0. So here you can see that we have our left table and our right table with 2 columns. And if we resize it right now, they're fixed widths, right? We define them at fixed widths, which you'll generally have to do to make them work for a desktop view. But in mobile, they're all whacked. And what we want to do is we actually want to be able to stack them. and make them behave. So what we can actually do is we can actually give each of these tables their own class. So let's give it its own separate class. We'll call it responsive table 2 for each of these, because all we're going to be doing is controlling the width of them. So what I can do is go back up to our CSS for our media query. I'm actually just going to copy and paste our first style, and I'll show you why, because we're going to add some styling to the first table here. So now these tables should respond once we hit our breakpoint of 600 pixels and both be 100% wide. And there you go. You can see that by automatically overriding the inline HTML with our media query and changing the width to 100%, it's now stacking. And it's actually even reverse stacking. So you can see that since we put the first table within a line of right, it shows up on the right for desktop. But then because it's first in the HTML for mobile and it's turning to a width of 100%, it's actually the first item shown. So you can actually use the align attribute and the order in which you place your HTML as a way to stack and move around your tables. And it's actually the preferred method that I like to use and what I recommend, because you can actually, there's actually better support for that method. Some people like floating actual table cells, but this to me is a more bulletproof way to do it. So it's a simple way to just respond and get your tables to stack nice and neat. So now we can do things to sort of optimize this view. So let's say for our first responsive table, we're actually going to say we want some padding of 10 pixels at the top and bottom and 5% to the left and right, which is a shorthand way to write padding if you aren't familiar with CSS. And actually, while we're at our CSS, let's just add in some body resets so we can make this nice and clean. We're just going to put our body at a padding of 0, a margin of 0, and I'm not liking this Times New Roman, so let's just change our font family to sans serif. And then we can just do some little optimizations for the different fonts, right? So underneath the headline here, let's add some padding to this table cell with this text so we can put in, let's say, a padding top of 20 pixels. Let's change the font size, make it a little bit bigger to 20 pixels. Actually, we can even change the padding to be a top and bottom of 20 pixels to add some spacing, right? And then we could add some padding to these different table cells here. So for that, we can just go in and add a padding of like 15 pixels for both, all the way around on all 4 sides. And then this is really just how you start to build a responsive email and start to optimize for it. And you can see that as you start to respond, it just works really, really nicely. So, and you can do things like change color, change font size, change padding, resize images, change the layout. There's really anything that you want to be able to do, you can do with the media queries where it's supported. There's a lot of awesome things that you can do. So again, Lauren, the one final thing too that you don't want to forget, it works since we're in the browser and it works great. But we want to be able to add in the specific meta tags that I talked about before when you go to testing. So I always forget to do this sometimes myself because I'm somebody who leaves it last. I should leave it first. But up at the top, you just add in a separate meta tag. So let's add in the one that will make our email responsive. So we're going to do meta name equals viewport. And then we're going to do content equals width equals device dash width, comma, initial dash scale equals 1. And that's our first meta tag, which will help make it responsive and sort of not resizable or scalable for devices. And then our second meta tag is going to help us with the Windows Phone. So we'll add in meta, and then we can do http-equiv equals capital X dash capital UA dash compatible, and then put in a content attribute of IE equals edge. And we can just do whatever with those. So those are the two meta tags that you want to put up at the top, which is in the head section of your HTML. And those should be the first things that you want to put in along with setting your character definition. So again, this is just a basic understanding of responsive email and how you can build a simple responsive template. It definitely gets a lot harder. It's important to note that I just use the styles and the HTML to sort of show you how to use responsive email. It doesn't take into account all the email things you need to do right now. So if you were to just run this test through different email clients, it's not optimized for everything. I specifically left out a bunch of code. But again, Lauren has shared that out, and we'll be following up with this example for you to use as well, to play around with. And so at this point, I think I'm just going to go back to our slides and go over a few resources for you. So here's a bunch of awesome tools and resources. So one of the great ones here, we have an awesome infographic, sort of the how-to guide to responsive email design. What we went over here today is much more in depth for the webinar, but it's a great infographic that you might find helpful on the Litmus blog. If you aren't familiar with code or don't really like using code, here's a couple of great resources I recommend for using drag and drop editors to build responsive email. The first is called Stamp Ready. So you can go to stampready.net. It's really cool. They have these draggable modules that you can just drag and drop and create emails and sort of edit with the WYSIWYG editor instead of actually managing code. So that's a great resource for you. Campaign Monitor has an amazing drag and drop tool called Canvas. We love Campaign Monitor, absolutely recommend them, really slick tool. So that's another awesome drag and drop editor for you to use to build emails. The tool that I used today to show you, in case you're wondering what editor that was, it's actually our own editor that we have here at Litmus. It's called Litmus Builder, and it's actually a free email editor for anybody to use. So even if you don't have a Litmus account, you can just go sign up and use Litmus Builder to build and test all of your emails. It's really, really amazing to build responsive emails with, as you might have seen, because it has the responsive previews and preview pane there. And it's just super, super fast to build emails. It's got a lot of email specific logic in there. I use it to build all the emails that we send out at Litmus. I really, really love it. ResponsiveEmailResources.com. So Brian Graves is an amazing email designer who has put together this awesome site. And there's also ResponsiveEmailPatterns.com as well for those of you who want to get into code. But it's an amazing list of responsive email resources. Definitely a go-to. MailChimp has an amazing, basically library of information over at templates.mailchimp.com. Basically, all the knowledge they have about HTML coding is there. So you'll find a lot of good stuff on responsive email. Campaign Monitor is a great resource. I've already recommended their tool Canvas, but if you go to campaignmonitor.com/CSS, they have this amazing support table for CSS. So for the main email clients, you can see what CSS is supported. Very, very helpful, especially for iPhone stuff, for mobile. If you ever have a question about sort of email coding or email design and development, we at the Litmus community have this amazing forum of email designers asking questions constantly and helping each other answer them. So if you're stuck with responsive email at any point in time, you can go to litmus.com/community and post any question you have or any problem that you have. And there's going to be this amazing community of email designers to help you. So it's completely free. Again, all you need to do is just create an account and just ask away questions. It's really helped me out too with overcoming a lot of the challenges that even we have here at Litmus, which is really, really cool. So definitely check that out. We also have a cool tool called Scope. So you go to litmus.com/scope. And basically, if you ever see an email that you really like, especially if it's a cool responsive thing that you saw, you can use Scope to actually inspect and see what the code is for an actual email. So you can see what cool techniques they used, etc. And it also creates a shareable version of the email. So I use it all the time and highly recommend it if you're trying to see how people are doing what they do with email. And again, just another plug for Litmus. You can actually test your email in over 40 different email clients with Litmus. So it's really great for troubleshooting, and testing your emails. We've got a bunch of mobile devices for iPhone, Android, iPads, and the different email apps. It's really, really great, really, really easy. And especially if you use Litmus Builder, it's got one-click testing integration, which is pretty killer. So we actually have a coupon code for you guys. If you go to litmus.com/gift card and input the coupon code responsive email, it's actually a 14-day free trial of Litmus. So you can get 14 days of testing for free. So I highly recommend you check it out, which is awesome. And I guess with that, we now have some time to take some questions and some Q&A. I'll try to help and answer as many as I can for you guys.
Thank you, Kevin. There were a ton of questions during this, so we'll try to get to as many as we can, and we will answer the rest of them in a follow-up blog post that recaps everything that Kevin has covered. And like he already said, we will be sending out the slides and recording within the next few days for this. And with that, let's dive into the questions. Do you think that the mobile rise has reached saturation, or do you think that it's going to continue to rise and get up to 70%, 80%, and so on?
So we've definitely seen mobile flatten out a little bit with its rise over the past few months. I think it's something that's going to continue to slowly grow. Just with the proliferation of mobile devices and more people getting various mobile devices, I think it's going to increase. But I think what's more important is really just understanding your audience and where your subscribers are opening their email. So I highly recommend you getting analytics to see where your subscribers are opening them, because then you can decide how important mobile is to your key audience. A fun fact here at Litmus is we actually only get around 10 to 15% of mobile opens on any given send, which is really low compared to the overall market. And if we were following the overall market numbers, we might be investing more time into mobile email development than we might need to. So I think it comes down to knowing your audience, and because some people might have 70% mobile opens already. So Litmus has email analytics for you to see where your subscribers are opening them. So I definitely recommend knowing your audience and sort of optimizing for your subscribers and where they're opening their email, and not necessarily relying completely on the total market. But I think mobile is going to continue to rise, especially with other devices that we don't even know exist yet, right? Like the smartwatch coming up, which will probably only have plain text email, but different devices like that. So I think it'll definitely continue to slowly rise.
There were a few questions about covering the difference between adaptive and responsive design, just clarifying the difference.
Sure. So with adaptive design, it's essentially fixed breakpoints or fixed widths at multiple breakpoints. I'm actually going to exit out of this slide really quickly here and go back to some of the examples so you can see. So if I go back to the example, an adaptive email, again, it uses media queries at various breakpoints, but the email is only a fixed width. It's not a fluid full width at those breakpoints. And that's the key difference. So for this template here, you can see that once we hit a certain breakpoint, it jumps to a fixed breakpoint. It's not taking up the full width of this breakpoint now and resizing and rescaling. It's simply a fixed width at that breakpoint. And if we go to another breakpoint, boom, you can see it jumps back down to a fixed width. So again, the thing about adaptive is it's a fixed width under multiple or various breakpoints. It just has to be a single breakpoint. It could be like one, and that could be considered adaptive. It could be multiple, but it's essentially a fixed width at a breakpoint. And that's what you see here. If I resize it, it's not resizing and rescaling. Unlike a responsive example here with a full email, if we resize it, you can see it's completely fluid. The width is completely changing and the content is changing because it's taking up the full width of the breakpoint. And that's a key difference. Adaptive is fixed width at certain breakpoints, and responsive is fluid widths at breakpoints. So that's the key difference behind it. And oh yeah, just as another point out for Builder, Litmus Builder, there's a gallery of amazing templates that you can access for free. And there's already a dozen of responsive templates, adaptive templates. There's various use cases because everybody has a different mobile strategy. There's about 30 templates in Builder by default that you can access and sort of start working on your email template to start. So I highly recommend checking that out as well for you to sort of play around with and get a better understanding of the different approaches.
One of the questions was how starting responsive design, it seems a lot very overwhelming. One client supports, another one doesn't. How do you jump in and get started in a responsive design without getting completely overwhelmed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's something that every email designer struggles with because there's so many moving variables and parts. I mean, to me, the obvious first step is to really just start with basic responsive design. Even though it may not be supported everywhere, at least you know it's getting supported in the key clients that do. And especially if you have a big Apple audience with iOS and iPad, they have amazing support for responsive email and just CSS in general. So even if that's what you're doing at a bare minimum, is starting to use media queries and basic responsive email, even if you aren't getting into super advanced tactics and worrying about all the email clients, at least you know you're doing everything that you can right off the bat to start to provide a great experience for certain subscribers. And the great news is that Apple does control a majority of the market for mobile users. So I would say that's a great first step. And then you can get into, as you start to develop and grow, your email campaigns and your email development strategy, you can start getting into more advanced techniques, which actually I'd like to go over in a future webinar to get things working well in the Gmail app, for instance, to really optimize the experience for those subscribers. So I would just say, just start doing basic responsive email, and hopefully these email clients will start supporting responsive email soon enough too, with how important mobile is becoming for a lot of their users. So, hopefully that happens too. And then that way, if they start supporting responsive email, then you don't even have to do anything if you're already, using the basic responsive email concepts that you should be. So that would be my recommendation to start, is just do that. And if the coding aspect overwhelms you, use the free tools like Stamp Ready or Canvas that will help you just essentially drag and drop and build an email, and they sort of take the hard development work over of coding. And that's what I would recommend if you're just trying to get started and feel like it's very, very overwhelming, even at the coding level.
Thanks, Kevin. What are the most common breakpoints that you should be using in responsive design? What do you recommend for using for breakpoints?
That's actually a great question. So traditionally, you'll see a lot of emails use a 300 pixel breakpoint for the width because that's what iPhones were for their typical size. However, with the introduction of the new iPhone 6s, the new iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, a lot of Samsung Android devices, which are bigger, screen sizes are getting much, much bigger now. So I think it comes down to your strategy. I know at Litmus, we actually use one breakpoint. Like we have our fixed width at 500 or 600 pixels, and then you use one breakpoint and make that completely responsive, which works really well since we have a one column design even for desktop. So if you're using one column design, that could work out really well for you. Maybe just starting your breakpoint at a larger size than maybe it typically would at 500 or 600 pixels. But if you're using a more advanced desktop layout, you may need multiple breakpoints, right? The key metric that I would use is that the iPhone 6 Plus is actually at 414 pixels now. So I think you need to start accommodating for a mobile optimized view at 414 pixels. And that's where your media query should, at the very least, start. Because, and then it's a whole bunch of fragmentation below that. So I would say at the very bare minimum, your media queries should start and be triggered at 414 pixels.
Great. There were a few questions about the code that you used. One of them was the fact that you didn't inline any of your styles. So would that be supported universally? And is padding supported across all of the major clients?
Sure. So padding is very well supported across clients, and that's why you'll see me typically use it for everything, even if you think, oh, you should be using margin. Margin does not have great support, so I highly recommend using padding. And in terms of not inlining, so for media queries, you can't inline CSS with media queries. Your media queries have to be in the head of your document for your style, in your style tags. They can't be inline. That's sort of how media queries work. So if an email client doesn't support styles in the head, such as Gmail, then your media query will get stripped and it won't work. And that's why I went over the whole section of how responsive email isn't supported everywhere. So there's really no workaround for that other than, uh, you know, this gets into a bit more advanced techniques, but there's things you can do to optimize your email as it looks sort of without media queries for mobile and sort of taking a mobile first approach. And that's something I'd love to go over in a future webinar. But that's essentially what you can do is you can, optimize your email for the mobile view in certain apps like that right away with inline styling, and then provide further enhancements for email clients that do support responsive email with media queries. But media queries cannot be inline; they have to be in the head of your document.
There were a bunch of questions about some of the Gmail apps not supporting responsive design. How do you recommend approaching designing for that client if you're using responsive design? And do you think that Gmail and the inbox apps will ever support media queries?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts on that last question for sure. But I do, just to answer that one quickly, I do think they will support it at some point. They have vocalized that it is, quote, a priority for them to support responsive email. So hopefully we'll see that at some point this year in 2015. I'm very hopeful that they will do it, even though they haven't made any traction in that area as of yet. So hopefully, and keep your fingers crossed, and definitely tweet at Gmail and let them know that you'd like to see this. The problem with them is that not enough users really are asking for responsive email. It's kind of a developer thing. So definitely make your voice heard and be proactive with them and reaching out to them and letting them know that you'd like to see that happen. So hopefully. And then in terms of dealing with the Gmail app, so again, like I said in the previous question, you definitely want to make sure that you can optimize your email to look great on mobile without media query. So making things like your font size, relatively easy to read without mobile styles, or your buttons bigger, you can really sort of enhance your design for it without media queries. Another technique which I can definitely add as a resource in a follow-up, which is more advanced and something I'd like to cover in a future webinar, is something called the hybrid coding approach, which is a new technique which is gaining a lot of traction in the email design and development community, which is doing a bunch of email hacks to work around Gmail and Outlook to make your email essentially quote unquote responsive everywhere. It's not technically using media queries everywhere. It's using a bunch of different hacks and workarounds and techniques to optimize specifically for the Gmail app, and then sort of enhancing and building out your email from there, and sort of really taking a mobile first approach. So I will definitely include resources for those of you who are interested to read up on that. But otherwise, I would just suggest doing things to make your email optimized on mobile to begin with. So bigger fonts, bigger, images and buttons, and more mobile friendly than the desktop might be if you have a big mobile audience. So that would be my recommendation.
Thanks, Kevin. And this is actually kind of a follow-up question to that. If you're using responsive design, but it's not supported in a specific client, say the Gmail app, what will it show in that client?
So it will show what your email looks like without media queries. The other thing too recently about the Gmail app, which I didn't really want to get into, is they have been testing this new feature where they're actually automatically showing you a quote mobile friendly version. And basically what they're doing is just bumping up the font size for you, which if you're using a desktop first layout, which is typically what I use a lot as well, can actually break your design. So it's something that you definitely need to test and look out for. And again, that's where, if you have a big Gmail audience, there's the different approaches that we talked about. Responsive email is great in the ideal state, but for those where, clients like the Gmail app don't support it, responsive email may not always be the best route if you have a desktop email that doesn't look great on mobile. You may want to use something like a fluid email approach, which will account more for a mobile first approach on the Gmail app right now instead of responsive email. So there's different considerations that go into that. But essentially, what you'll see for the Gmail app is what your email would look like on desktop or scaled, your desktop design scaled to at some point, or even the mobile friendly version being automatically displayed, which they're testing currently. So that's typically what you're going to see with Gmail right now.
Do you recommend using pixels or for font measurements?
So for email, you always want to use pixels. I know that may cause a lot of anger with web designers and wanting to use M's, but the fact is there's just not enough support for it in email clients. So always use pixels.
A few people were asking after looking at your code in the example email why you were using tables rather than divs.
Sure. So if you aren't familiar with email design, the reason we don't use divs is because they are not supported in all email clients, which I know may be a shock for some, but it's just not supported specifically as it pertains to Outlook, which is a very big portion of, or a considerable portion of the market, especially if you're a B2B company like us. For Litmus, we have, 35% of 40% of our audience uses Outlook to open our emails. So what you need to do is you actually need to use tables to make sure that your layout is a sound foundation and structure and can actually render properly. Otherwise, it's just going to be broken in a lot of the email clients. So that's the reason why we use a table structure for email design instead of divs. And until email clients get better rendering engines, if you didn't know, Outlook 2007 to 2013 actually uses Microsoft Word as a rendering engine. Not even, they went from Internet Explorer in 2000 to 2003 to upgrading to Microsoft Word as a rendering engine. So there's just a lot of rendering engines out there that don't support divs in the div structure right now, which is why we need to rely on tables for our email design. The good news is that tables can be used with responsive designs. So that is the good news about it.
Do you have to put a class of responsive table or a different class necessary on every nested table, or should the one on the container table cover everything?
So that can come down a lot to the different techniques and structure that you have. Typically, you always want to have, your your container table resized, and then depending on the content that you have within it, is whether you'll need additional styling or not. For fixed things, so if you have fixed widths on anything, images or tables, you need to resize those and apply a class that resizes those so that it doesn't break the responsive design. So that's really what it comes down to. It comes down to how much content you have nested inside of your container and whether you have any fixed widths inside of that container that would break the responsive elements to the design. So again, if anything fixed like tables or images or whatnot, anything inside of those that need to be resized would need to be accounted for in addition to your containing table, which is resized as well.
We're 5 minutes past the hour, so I'm going to start closing up the questions. I do have one last one. Similar to frameworks for the webs like Foundation or Bootstrap, are there any responsive email frameworks out there? Whoever had this question, that they work in a fast-paced environment where they might crank out 3 emails a day, and for them it's better to be more efficient than to fully custom code the responsiveness in every single email that they're sending out.
Sure, yeah. So there are several email frameworks out there. So Zerb actually has a framework called Ink out there that you can look up, which is an email framework, very similar to Foundation. The one warning I would give to you about Ink is that it does sort of break in Outlook 2007 to 2013. So you may have to rework and retool some of it. They haven't updated their framework to account for that yet. But a lot of that has probably the same patterns and concepts that you're familiar with and would like to use. So you can check out Zerb's Inc. And I'll make sure I'll follow up with some of these resources as well. There's also a cool SaaS framework called Zenith by Alex Ilhan that you can look up on GitHub, which is cool because it's really taking in some modern components. Dan Denny has an awesome setup called Email. It's like EMAYLL, and it uses sort of Jekyll and Front Matter as a way to manage emails and produce emails. There's a whole bunch of awesome stuff on GitHub if you really look into it, especially even grunt tasks and gulp tasks for sending out email tests and sort of automatically inlining CSS and optimizing images and just running certain tasks like that. So if you're looking for more developer resources, feel free to tweet me at Kevin Mandeville as well, and I can easily follow up with those with you. But yeah, those are some of the cool things that are happening off the top of my head, but there's a whole bunch of awesome stuff out there for more developer focused resources.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And with that, we still have so many unanswered questions that we will definitely get to in a follow-up blog post. And we definitely plan on doing more webinars like this in the future due to the popularity of this one. We'll probably do one similar to this as well as ones that are more advanced. So stay tuned for emails and tweets about those. And stay tuned as well for the recording and slides, which we will be sending out within the next few days. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks so much, guys. Catch you at future webinars. Looking forward to seeing you out there and coding awesome responsive emails.